There's a photograph taken in London in 1944. A woman sits at a desk in Baker Street headquarters, reviewing personnel files. She's elegant, composed, impeccably dressed. Her expression reveals nothing. In front of her are dossiers containing the names, backgrounds, and psychological assessments of young women secretaries, teachers, housewives who have volunteered for something they don't fully understand yet. By the end of that week, she will select which of them will be trained as agents. By the end of that year, several of them will be dead. By the end of her life, she will never forgive herself for what she did in that office. Her name was Vera Atkins, and while history remembers the female agents of the Special Operations Executive who parachuted into Nazi-occupied France, history has almost entirely forgotten the woman who sent them there. This is entire the story of the brave women who died in concentration camps or survived torture by the Gestapo. This is the story of the woman who recruited them, trained them, briefed them on their final night in England, watched them board aircraft bound for enemy territory, and then lived with what happened next. This is about the psychological burden carried by the person who doesn't go into the field, who doesn't face the firing squad, who survives while others don't. And it's set about a secret she kept from almost everyone, that she was a Romanian-born Jew operating at the highest levels of British intelligence while concealing her own identity, sending others to fight Nazis who would have murdered her on sight if they'd known who she really was. By the time you finish listening to this, you will understand why Vera Atkins spent 3 decades searching for the bodies of women she'd sent to their deaths, why she could never reconcile what she'd done with what she'd believed was necessary, and why the British establishment quietly erased her from official histories even as they celebrated the agents she'd deployed. This is the story of the Spymaster history forgot, and the guilt that consumed her until the day she died. Vera Maria Rosenberg was born in Bucharest in 1908 into a wealthy Jewish family that had prospered in Romania's cosmopolitan capital. Her father, Max Rosenberg, was a German Jewish businessman. Her mother, Hilda, came from a prominent Romanian Jewish family. Young Vera grew up speaking German, Romanian, French, and English fluently, moving easily through the sophisticated world of European high society. She attended finishing schools in Paris and Switzerland, learning the social graces expected of wealthy European women between the wars. On the surface, she was being prepared for a life of comfortable privilege, marriage to a suitable husband, management of household staff, attendance at the right social functions. But Vera was observing something else during those years in Europe. She watched the rise of fascism across the continent. She saw Jewish businesses boycotted in Germany. She heard the increasingly violent rhetoric against people like her family, and she understood, perhaps earlier than many of her contemporaries, that this wasn't going to end peaceably. When her family relocated to London in the late 1930s, Vera made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would fight back, but she would have to do it while concealing exactly who she was. The problem was straightforward but profound. British intelligence services in the late 1930s were not particularly welcoming to women, and they certainly weren't recruiting foreign-born Jews into sensitive positions. Vera needed to become someone else. She took her mother's maiden name Atkins, which sounded reassuringly English. She carefully modified her background in conversations and on forms, emphasizing her British education and downplaying her Bucharest childhood. She adopted the mannerisms, speech patterns, and social style of the English upper class with such precision that most people who met her assumed she'd been born into it. It was, in a sense, her first intelligence operation, creating a legend, a cover identity that would allow her to operate in a world that would have rejected her real self. In 1941, Vera secured a position with the Special Operations Executive, the secret organization Winston Churchill had created with a directive to set Europe ablaze through sabotage, subversion, and intelligence gathering behind enemy lines. So needed people with language skills, European connections, and the kind of sophisticated understanding of continental society that Vera possessed. She started in a junior role, but her capabilities quickly became apparent. She had an extraordinary memory for detail, an ability to assess character rapidly, and perhaps most importantly, an absolute commitment to the mission that bordered on obsession. By 1943, she'd become the intelligence officer for SOE's French section, responsible for the recruitment, assessment, training, and deployment of agents into Nazi-occupied France. This is where her story becomes complicated in ways that intelligence historians still debate today. Because what Vera Atkins did, starting in 1943 and continuing until the war's end, was identify young women who might be suitable for intelligence work, put them through brutal training programs, and then send them into one of the most dangerous operational environments in the history of espionage. And she did this knowing that their chances of survival were, at best, uncertain. The women she recruited came from diverse backgrounds. Some were British citizens who had grown up in France and spoke the language perfectly. Others were French nationals who de-escaped to England after the fall of France and wanted to return to fight. Many were in their 20s. Several were mothers. What they had in common was a willingness to volunteer for dangerous work and some connection to France that made them credible as French civilians. Vera's job was to assess whether they had the psychological resilience, presence of mind under pressure, and the capacity for deception that clandestine work demanded. The training program she sent them through was designed to break them. Candidates were subjected to surprise interrogations in the middle of the night. They were followed through towns to see if they'd noticed surveillance. They were placed in scenarios designed to provoke panic or force quick decisions. Those who showed fear too readily, who cracked under pressure, or who seemed likely to compromise security were removed from the program. Those who passed were given false identities, cover stories they had to memorize in exhaustive detail, and training in everything from silent killing to radio operation to coding and decoding messages. Then they were given a final briefing, usually conducted by Vera herself, sent to the aircraft that would drop them into occupied France. Vera's role in those final briefings became something she never spoke about publicly, but survivors remembered it decades later. She was the last person they saw before boarding the plane. She checked their French identity papers one final time. She verified they were UNT, carrying anything that would identify them as British and English bus ticket in a pocket, a laundry mark with a London address. She reminded them of their cover stories, and then she sent them through the door and watched them leave. Some of the women who survived the war later said that Vera's composure in those moments was both reassuring and haunting. She seemed so certain, so confident that they could do this. They didn't realize until much later that she was watching them leave while already knowing that some of them would never return. The operational reality of SOE networks in France was brutal. The Gestapo and the Abwehr, German military intelligence, were sophisticated counterintelligence organizations. They'd infiltrated resistance networks, captured agents, and in some cases turned them into double agents who helped identify newly arrived operatives. Radio operators were particularly vulnerable. German direction-finding equipment could locate a transmitter if it stayed on the air too long, and the Gestapo had become expert at capturing operators and forcing them to continue transmitting under German control. Women agents faced additional dangers. If captured, they were often subjected to interrogations that included sexual violence and torture specifically designed to exploit what the Gestapo assumed were female vulnerabilities. Vera knew all of this. Intelligence reports crossed her desk daily. She read the decoded messages from agents in the field reporting suspicious activity, narrow escapes, and deteriorating security situations. She knew when radio operators missed their scheduled transmission times. She knew when agents sent coded distress signals, and she had to make decisions about whether to extract compromised agents, whether to send reinforcements into networks that might already be, and whether to warn agents that their security might be compromised when doing so could itself compromise other operations. This is where the moral weight of her position becomes almost unbearable to contemplate. Because Vera wasn't just a bureaucrat pushing papers. She'd recruited these women. She'd interviewed them. She'd approved their training. She'd sent them to France. And now she was reading intelligence reports suggesting that some of them were missing, that others had been arrested, that networks were collapsing, and she couldn't always act on that information immediately because doing so might alert the Germans that British intelligence knew their networks had been penetrated. The file that haunted her most involved the Prosper network in Paris, one of SOE's largest and most ambitious operations in occupied France. In 1943, multiple agents in that network were arrested by the Gestapo in what appeared to be a coordinated German counterintelligence. She'd sent them to France. Several of the captured agents were women Vera had personally recruited and briefed. The security collapse was catastrophic. Meetings compromised, safe houses raided, radio operators captured. Vera received reports that at least some of the arrested agents were being held at Gestapo headquarters on Avenue Foch in Paris, where interrogations were conducted using methods that violated every provision of the Geneva Conventions. What she couldn't do was mount immediate rescue operations. What she couldn't do was publicly acknowledge that British intelligence had lost contact with these agents. What she had to do was continue the war effort, continue recruiting new agents, continue sending them to France, and wait. The waiting was its own form of torture. Every week that passed without contact from a missing agent made survival less likely. Every intelligence report suggesting that the Germans had broken another network meant more captured agents, more interrogations, more names extracted under torture that could lead to more arrests. Vera maintained her professional composure throughout this period. Colleagues at Baker Street headquarters remembered her as efficient, precise, demanding, and seemingly unflappable. She insisted on perfect preparation for every agent deployment. She personally reviewed every detail of every mission. She maintained exhaustive files on every agent's background, cover story, and operational assignments. To those who worked with her, she appeared to be the ideal intelligence officer, dedicated, thorough, emotionally detached from the human cost of the operations she managed. But those who knew her better saw something else. Maurice Buckmaster, the head of SOE's French section, later wrote that Vera worked with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She stayed in the office long after others had left. She reviewed files repeatedly, looking for details that might have been missed. When agents went missing, she pursued every possible avenue for information, contacting other intelligence services, interrogating returned agents about what they might have seen or heard, analyzing German communications intercepts for any mention of British agents in custody. It was as if she believed that if she worked hard enough, paid enough attention to detail, maintained enough control over the process, she could somehow keep them safe. She couldn't. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, more than a dozen female SOE agents were confirmed dead or missing in France. Others were unaccounted for. The women's families wrote to SOE headquarters asking for information. What had happened to their daughters, their sisters, their wives? Where were they? Were they alive? Were they being held in prisoner of war camps? When would they come home? Vera didn't have answers. The chaos of Germany's collapse meant that prisoner records were scattered or destroyed. Concentration camps had been liberated by Allied forces, but the administrative systems that might have tracked which prisoners had been where and when were fragmentary at best. Some female agents had been held under false names. Others had been moved multiple times between different facilities. The Gestapo officers who might have known what happened to captured agents were themselves now fugitives, in custody or dead. What Vera did next defined the second half of her life and revealed something about the guilt she carried. In the summer of 1945, as other SOE officers were demobilized and returned to civilian life, Vera volunteered for a different mission. She would go to Germany. She would find out what happened to the missing female agents. She would locate their graves if they'd been executed, their last places of detention if they'd died in camps, and the German officials who'd been responsible for their interrogations and deaths. And she would do this not as an abstract bureaucratic exercise, but as a personal mission to account for the women she'd sent to their deaths. The investigation she conducted over the next several years was one of the most thorough and harrowing individual efforts to document Nazi war crimes against specific victims. Vera traveled through devastated Germany, interviewing former Gestapo officers, prison guards, concentration camp administrators, and anyone else who might have information. She located the execution sites where some of the female agents had been shot. She traced the transport records that showed which women had been sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. She interviewed survivors who'd been imprisoned alongside the British agents and could testify to what happened to them. What she discovered was worse than anyone had wanted to imagine. Several of the female SOE agents had been sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp in eastern Germany, where they'd been held in brutal conditions before being executed. The circumstances of their deaths varied. Some were shot, others were hanged. At least one was killed by lethal injection in what the camp administration recorded as a medical experiment. Vera documented each case with grim precision. She identified the German officials who had given the orders. She had located witnesses who could describe the final moments of the women who died. She collected evidence that would later be used in war crimes trials. The agent whose fate affected Vera most profoundly was Noor Inayat Khan, a young woman of Indian and American parentage who had served as a radio operator in Paris. Noor had been captured by the Gestapo in October 1943 and held in harsh conditions, first in Paris and later in Germany. Despite brutal interrogation, she'd refused to provide information about her network or her fellow agents. The Gestapo classified her as highly dangerous and kept her in solitary confinement. In September 1944, she was transferred to Dachau concentration camp, where she was executed by a shot to the back of the head. She was 30 years old. Vera located the records of Noor's execution, interviewed former Dachau guards who remembered her, and documented the circumstances of her death with the same meticulous attention to detail she'd once applied to mission briefings. Another case involved Violette Szabo, a young widow and mother who volunteered for SOE service after her husband was killed fighting in North Africa. Violette had been captured after a firefight with German troops during her second mission to France. She'd been interrogated at Gestapo headquarters in Paris, then sent to Ravensbrück despite torture and appalling conditions. She'd maintained a cover story and protected other members of her network. In late January 1945, as Soviet forces approached Ravensbrück, she was among a group of female SOE agents taken to a separate area of the camp and executed by shooting. She was 23 years old. Vera tracked down the SS officer who'd given the execution order and the guard who'd been present when Violette was killed. As Vera compiled these accounts, she also uncovered evidence of the specific interrogation techniques the Gestapo had used against female agents. The methods were designed to break psychological resistance through a combination of physical torture, sexual humiliation, isolation, and threats against the agents' families. Some women had been held in underground cells without light or adequate sanitation for weeks. Others had been subjected to mock executions meant to induce terror and cooperation. The interrogation reports Vera found some of them still in Gestapo files and occupied Germany made clear that the Germans had understood these women were British intelligence agents and had treated them accordingly, which under Nazi doctrine meant they were not protected by the laws of war and could be subjected to whatever methods might extract information. What haunted Vera most wasn't just that these women had died, but the specific circumstances of how they'd died and what they'd endured before death. She'd known, intellectually, that captured agents faced interrogation and imprisonment, but reading the detailed accounts of what that meant in practice, the specific tortures, the degrading conditions, the final moments before execution forced her to confront exactly what she'd sent them into. She'd briefed them on resistance to interrogation techniques. She'd assured them that Britain would attempt to locate and recover captured agents. She'd told them their sacrifice mattered, Now she was reading the documentation of what their sacrifice had actually consisted of. The families of the dead agents wanted answers, and Vera provided them, though she often edited what she revealed based on what she thought the families could bear. To Noor Inayat Khan's mother, she described Noor's courage and resistance, but softened the details of her final conditions at Dachau. To Violette Szabo's daughter, a little girl who lost both her father and her mother to the war, Vera presented a version that emphasized Violette's bravery and the importance of her work while omitting the specifics of her execution. It was another form of burden, deciding what truth could be shared and what truth was too terrible to impose on grieving families. The question that intelligence historians and ethical philosophers have debated ever since is whether Vera Atkins bears personal responsibility for what happened to these women. The arguments on one side are straightforward. She recruited them. She approved their deployment. She sent them into occupied France knowing the risks were extreme. Some of her colleagues later claimed she'd been too willing to deploy agents into networks that were already showing signs of compromise. The Prosper network collapse, some argued, should have prompted a complete halt to deployments until security could be re-established. But Vera and her superiors had continued operations. From this perspective, she was complicit in their deaths not criminally, but morally. The counter-argument is equally compelling. Vera was operating within a military and intelligence structure during total war against Nazi Germany. The female agents she deployed were volunteers who'd been thoroughly briefed on the dangers. The intelligence they gathered and the sabotage operations they supported contributed to Allied victory. The alternative to sending agents into France wasn't keeping them safe in England, it was losing the war. Vera's job was to win the war, not to protect individual agents from all possible harm. From this perspective, she did what her duty required, and the guilt she carried afterward was a personal moral response to decisions that were professionally sound. But there's a third perspective that's perhaps closer to what Vera herself believed. Based on what she said in the rare interviews she gave late in her life, she never claimed she'd been wrong to send the women to France. She never said the operations weren't necessary. What she did say was that she'd lived with them every day since she remembered each of them, that she'd failed to protect them adequately, and that she could never reconcile the necessity of what she'd had done with the human cost of having done it. It wasn't a question of whether the operations were justified. It was a recognition that justification doesn't erase guilt, that doing what's necessary in war doesn't mean living easily with having done it. There's another layer to Vera's story that she concealed even more carefully than her operational activities. Throughout her entire time with SO, she'd been operating under her adopted identity as Vera Atkins, British subject and loyal intelligence officer. But she remained legally and actually Vera Rosenberg, Romanian-born Jew whose family had fled Europe to escape precisely the forces she was now fighting. If the Germans had captured her, if her true background had been exposed, she would have been treated not as a prisoner of war but as a Jewish enemy of the Reich, which meant almost certain deportation to a concentration camp and death. She was sending other women to face dangers while concealing that she faced similar dangers if her identity were exposed. And she carried the additional burden of knowing that the women she sent to concentration camps like Ravensbrück were dying in facilities designed primarily to exterminate people like her. When she investigated what happened to Noor Inayat Khan at Dachau, she was walking through a camp where thousands of Jews had been murdered. When she documented the deaths at Ravensbrück, she was reviewing records from a facility where Jewish women were worked to death, starved, beaten, and executed. The women she'd sent there had died because they were British intelligence agents. She would have died there simply for being Jewish. Why did she maintain the deception even after the need for it had passed? Part of the answer may lie in British intelligence culture of the era, which remained uncomfortable with foreigners in sensitive positions even after the war. But part of it may have been personal. If she acknowledged that she'd been a Jewish refugee operating under false identity, it changed the narrative of her war service from dedicated intelligence officer to Jewish woman with personal stake in defeating Nazis. It made her appear less objective, more personally motivated. In the 1940s and 1950s, British intelligence establishment, that perception could have undermined her credibility in ways that would have affected not just her reputation, but also the historical assessment of the operations she'd managed and the women she'd sent to France. So she remained Vera Atkins, kept her secrets, and continued her investigations into the fate of the missing agents long after the official inquiries had concluded. She never married, she never had children. She maintained an apartment in London that colleagues described as almost austere place to sleep and work, not really a home. She attended memorial services for the dead agents. She stayed in contact with some of the survivors. And she worked, for the rest of her professional life, in positions connected to intelligence and security. The recognition she received for her wartime service was substantial but always slightly awkward. She was appointed a commander of the Order of the British Empire. The French government made her a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. Intelligence historians acknowledged her crucial role in SOE operations, but the public recognition always focused on her organizational skills and administrative contributions, not on the moral weight of the decisions she'd made or the personal mission she'd undertaken to account for the dead. She was praised for efficiency, not for the guilt-driven investigation that had consumed years of her life. The female agents she'd sent to France became, over time, celebrated figures in British war history. Noor Inayat Khan was honored with memorials. Violette Szabo's story was told in books and films. Odette Sansom, who survived Ravensbrück and returned to England, became a public figure who gave lectures about her experiences. But Vera remained in the background. When journalists or historians wanted to know about female agents, they interviewed the agents who'd survived or told the stories of those who'd died. They rarely asked about the woman who'd sent them, who'd selected them, who'd briefed them on their final night in England. In the 1980s, when she was in her 70s, Vera began giving occasional interviews about her wartime work. These conversations revealed something about how she'd processed what she'd done. She spoke about the female agents with a mixture of professional assessment and personal affection. She remembered details about their personalities, their strengths, their fears. She described the women who'd died with a precision that suggested she'd reviewed their files many times over the decades, and when asked directly whether she felt responsible for their deaths, she gave an answer that captured the moral complexity of what she'd lived with. I did what was necessary. They did what was necessary. Necessary things don't become less painful because they're necessary. She also spoke, though less frequently, about the investigation she'd conducted to find out what happened to them. This seemed to be, for her, the partial redemption for having sent them to their deaths that she'd at least ensured their stories were told. Their deaths were documented, and the people responsible were held accountable. She'd given the dead agents the dignity of being remembered individually, not as statistics and casualty reports. She'd made certain their families knew, as much as possible, what had happened. It didn't absolve her of guilt, but it was what she could do afterward. Vera Atkins died in 2000 at the age of 92. The obituaries acknowledged her wartime service and her post-war investigations. The intelligence community recognized her contributions to Allied victory. But the obituaries were brief, and the recognition was limited. She'd never written a memoir. She'd never sought publicity. She'd remained, even in death, slightly peripheral to the story, the person who'd shaped events but stood outside the narrative of those events. And that, perhaps, is the final tragedy of her story. History remembers the brave women who parachuted into occupied France, who sent coded messages, who sabotaged Nazi operations, who died in concentration camps. History remembers them as heroes, which they were. But history has largely forgotten the woman who selected them, trained them, sent them, and then spent 30 years documenting how they died. The woman who carried the guilt of command, the burden of survival, and the secret of her own concealed identity. The woman who sent 50 women to almost certain deaths and then devoted the rest of her life to ensuring they were UN forgotten, even as she herself was gradually erased from the historical record. The question she never fully answered, and that perhaps can't be answered, is what it does to a person to make those decisions. To look across a desk at a young woman 23 years old, mother of a small child, volunteering for dangerous work, and decide yes. Send her to France, knowing that she might be captured, tortured, executed. To do that not once but repeatedly. To receive the intelligence reports suggesting networks are compromised and decide to send more agents anyway because the mission requires it. To live with the knowledge that you made the correct strategic decisions and that those decisions resulted in the deaths of women you'd personally recruited and briefed. Vera never claimed she'd been wrong. She never said the operation shouldn't have been conducted. But she also never claimed that doing what was necessary made it easier to live with having done it. She carried the weight of those decisions for 55 years after the war ended. She spent decades investigating what happened to the women she'd sent. She maintained meticulous files on each of them, files that she reviewed repeatedly until the end of her life. And she remained, always, slightly apart from the celebrations and commemorations, as if she didn't even believe she'd earned the right to share in the recognition given to the women who'd actually gone to France and faced the dangers she'd sent them into. The last interview she gave, a year before her death, when he included a moment that captures something essential about who she was and what she'd lived with. The interviewer asked whether she'd ever regretted her decision to join WWII and take on the role of recruiting and deploying female agents. Vera paused for a long time before answering. Then she said, "Regret suggests you wish you'd done something differently. I don't wish that. The work was necessary. The women were extraordinary. What I wish is that it hadn't been necessary, but it was, so I did it and I lived with it. It's all anyone can do." She died a few months later, quietly, in her London apartment. The obituaries noted her wartime service. A few intelligence historians wrote longer appreciations of her contributions to operations. The families of some of the women she'd sent to France attended her memorial service, but there was no public funeral, no major commemorations, no widespread recognition of her death. She'd lived quietly after the war, and she died quietly. Her files, the meticulous documentation she'd kept on every female agent she'd deployed, were eventually archived. Researchers who examined them say they show an extraordinary attention to detail and an obvious personal investment in the women whose lives she'd shaped. Every agent has a detailed dossier. Every operation is carefully documented. Every investigation into the fate of missing agents is thoroughly recorded. The files reveal a woman who dedicated herself absolutely to the work and who carried the weight of that work long after the need for it had ended. Today, if you visit the memorial to SO agents in London, you'll see the names of the women who died in France: Noor Inayat Khan, Violette Szabo, Denise Blog, Cecily Leffert. The list continues. These women are remembered, honored, studied. Books are written about them, films tell their stories. They've become symbols of courage, resistance, and sacrifice. Vera Atkins' name isn't on that memorial. She's not in the films. The books written about female SO agents mention her, usually briefly. As the administrative officer who prepared them for deployment, she remains, even now, in the background of the story, the woman who sent the heroines, not a heroine herself. But perhaps that's how she would have wanted it. Because the burden she carried was the burden of being captured or tortured or executed in a concentration camp. It was the burden of sending others to face those fates, the burden of survival, the burden of selection, the burden of living with the decisions that were necessary and terrible in equal measure, the burden of being the person who says yes, send her, and then lives with what comes after. That burden doesn't come with medals or memorials. It comes with decades of guilt, investigation, and memory. Vera Atkins carried it from 1943 until her death in 2000. She never claimed she deserved recognition for carrying it. She just carried it. That was her mission. After the missions ended to remember the women, everyone else would eventually forget she'd sent, and to never forgive herself for having been the one who survived.